Okay, thank you, Dark, very much. Yes, like you said, I'm very new to this project, so most of the credit goes to Igor, and all the substantive questions should go to him, I think. And I'm responsible for the numbers and pictures. So most of this presentation is numbers and pictures. That's why I'm doing it. Yeah, so I'm just discovering this project for myself right now during the conference, and I see how connected this presentation is to all the others, and how unique this presentation is also compared to the others. And here we will be connecting some fundamental dimensions of social judgment, which are widely described in social psychology, with some dimensions of wisdom, which I call dimensions of wisdom, which consist of wisdom itself, knowledge, and understanding. So the existing research is mostly speculative, and there are some speculations about Easterners versus Westerners, and Easterners are supposed to be focused on some social emotional issues and see the judgments and have a conception of wisdom related to social emotional lens, right? It connects to the research on the attention towards context and object, right? And Easterners are mostly apparently oriented towards social emotional competence, whereas Westerners more individualistic. They supposedly are more analytically oriented and focused on rationality. But this is pretty much speculative, and it hasn't been investigated as much. So this is one reason to do this research. The other reason is to enhance the to contribute to social psychology, which has a wide research on social judgment, and it's a work of Susan Fisk, of Abelin Wojcicki, Judd, and others, and there are many different dimensions which more or less converge into general dimensions related to some analytical, agentic, intellectual versus some social emotional and interpersonal wisdom, right? Yeah, and interesting point is that some papers claim that these two dimensions are opposite to each other, and other papers say that they correlated positively, and we should expect that they go together, and it's just two different dimensions of the same thing, and they don't exclude each other. Another point is that cross-cultural evidence is not that clear, and most of the work was made in weird countries, as we call it, like, right, white, educated, rich, and industrialized. And we know very little about how these theories work in non-Western, non-weird countries. Key research questions were, what latent dimensions guide social judgment of wisdom-related behaviors? And of course, we had some expectations in regard to point one, because there is an abundant research on that. More interesting was the question on the second point, second question, do these judgmental dimensions vary by culture? And this question was more interesting, and we expected more surprising results. We were ready for surprises, let's say so. And finally, how do these dimensions, behavioral dimensions or state dimensions of action, I will go into detail a little further. How do these dimensions contribute to evaluating wisdom, knowledge, and understanding? The data came from this project, and you know very well these 16 samples. And we grouped them to 8 larger samples. In order to make the statistical models work better, to make them more stable, and overall we had 2,700 unique respondents, and from statistical point it's not that much, so that was the reason of making these samples a bit larger. Yes, student and general populations and average age across all the samples was 30, but there was a big variance of age and gender composition across these samples. The general workflow of the method was, a general idea was to merge somehow the evaluations of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, and some judgments of how people behave. And the link between these two counterparts was established through 10 agents. So people first, at first, the participants were supposed to compare a pair of agents. For instance, a 75-year-old person who has a lot of life experience and many stories to share with character named you, right? And this couple, this pair of characters, of agents, was compared by participants using 19 different behaviors. Behaviors in a broad sense, there was some thinking and recognizing and applying actions involved. So it's not just physical behaviors, it's also mental behaviors. Right, that was the first part. Yes, and it seems that every participant was made a total of 171 comparisons, which is some substantial information to use. And the second part was a very simple rating of every character by 3 dimensions, by wisdom, knowledgeable, and understanding. How wise every character is, from not wise at all to extremely wise. These 2 parts were sort of disconnected, and the only part that allowed us to match them was the same characters that were used in both parts. So in this way, we measured implicit theories in the sense that they didn't ask directly what would the wise person do, right? It was separated. Who is more likely to do or behave in this way, and who is wise. So this complex design led us to very complicated multi-level, multiple group models, structural equation models, which at the same time controlled for response bias, allowed us to test these measurements for measurement invariance across cultures, and also made it possible to differentiate within person structure from between individual differences. But since we found that these within and between levels were very, very similar, in this presentation, I focus on the within structure only, but probably it's not even important. Yes, because these structures were very similar. So going to the results. First, starting with simple descriptive statistics, and here we can see the rankings of agents by 3 dimensions. These are simple means and frequencies. We can see that, for instance, scientist is the first by knowledge, second by wisdom, and fourth by understanding. In general observation is that the knowledge and wisdom worked very similarly, and understanding was something outstanding. It always showed some differences from these the first 2 characteristics. There was also some differences across countries, which here represented by these vertical ticks. It's just to show that there was some variance across cultural groups. And analytical part starts here, and we conducted the factor analysis on these 19 items and came up with this structure. The first factor was all about thinking, think, right? The first 3 items with the largest factor loadings started with think. Apply some experiences, recognize, and control of emotions. So there are 2 parts of this factor, which we called rational deliberation. One part is thinking, very cerebral, very cold, and controlling for emotions, not showing emotions. It's coldness, right? It's the second part. And they go together always, at least in this sample. And the second factor is about considering someone else, about others, considering someone else's perspective, care for others' feelings, listening to what somebody is telling them, and regardless of divinity or emotions, or is it about intellectual stuff? It's like paying attention. And we labeled this factor socio-emotional competence, which colloquially can be connected to Yoda type of wisdom, right? And the first factor is related to Spock, a kind of wisdom. And the interesting part is that these 2 factors were positively correlated. And in some cultures, they were correlated very strongly. In some cultures, the correlation wasn't that strong. But in general, on the overall sample, the correlation was quite strong, and it was 0.67, which is almost a third, which is considered quite strong correlation for such a large sample. This is already addressed one of our key questions. Next, here we can see the map with these 2 factors. On the horizontal axis is rational deliberation, and on the vertical axis, social emotional competence, right? And the gray lines here represent the ratings of you character, so self-ratings, basically. And all the other characters are here represented relative to you character. Well, the picture in general quite predictable, right? The 12 years old is the obvious outlier, which is low by both rationality and social-emotional stuff. And here the picture doesn't look linear, right? We don't see a very clear pattern in these characters. So we can see some sort of positive pattern coming from religious towards teacher, and some negative pattern coming from fair person to politician. It implies that these 2 dimensions are actually separate, and they do not coincide.
No. Sort of issue to this. Okay, so let me just text it. Let me make sure.
Maxim, you froze. You were at it suggests, and then we lost the what I was suggesting.
Yeah.
Was I on this slide?
Yes,
okay, yes.
Because in the middle of that slide, you had described the positive and the negative relation, and then you froze right there.
Oh, all right. Okay. Right. We cannot see any linear relations here. We can see some positive trend from 12 years old towards teacher, right? And we can see also a negative trend say, coming from fair person to scientist and politician, right? So the relations, if we between these two factors, are not quite linear. And there is even some negative trend. This is an important point because I will come back to it a bit later. Right, and here is the same map, but plotted for each country separately and is estimated in each country separately on the comparable dimensions. Oh yes, very important thing I forgot to say. There was a measurement invariance found for these dimensions, which means that these factors, the structure of the factors, was exactly the same, almost exactly, approximately the same in all these 8 groups. This is a very important point. It talks towards universality of these two factors, and also allows us to correctly compare these factors across countries. And here we can see the same plot, but separated, split by the groups, the cultural groups. It's not always a single country. First of all, there is a very similar pattern in every country, similar pattern of the locations of characters, and I can highlight here, for instance, Morocco, which is a very interesting case, and we can see that the U point is the highest on social emotional competence, unlike other countries, which means that Moroccans, the participants of the study, are rated themselves as much more social emotional competent people compared to all the 10 characters, all the other 9 characters. Another outlier is South Africa, and you can see that here the points are very close to each other, which means that South African samples rated different characters very similarly on both dimensions, which probably which results in high correlation between these two factors and talks towards some lack of differentiation between these two factors. Well, jump into interpretations, it might imply that a South African sample considered characters in a holistic way, assigning one character all the different behaviors and not assigning all the characters, or all the behaviors, all the acts to other agents, right? So they were sort of focused on agents rather than on dimensions, and it talks to the differentiation between analytical and holistic thinking. Here's the same map, but there is another layer of wisdom, which was one of the purposes of the study. And we can see the location is exactly the same as on the previous maps, but the color now represents the wisdom, and the wisest person character on average was medical doctor, right? And we can see that it's not necessarily high on both dimensions. Yes, it is high on rational deliberation, but it is not that high. It's in the middle, basically, on social emotional competence. This is one important point, which suggests that wisdom is judged mostly by ability of thinking rationally, deliberate rationally, not by social emotional thing. Knowledge is even closer related to rational deliberation, and even less by social emotional competence. A bit different is with understanding, and we can see that although there is some nonlinear relations, but understanding is more related to social emotional competence, compared to knowledge and wisdom, which I showed on the previous slide. And here are the analytical way of presenting it. It's a standardized regression coefficient. And we can see that here the blue is positive associations and red negative associations, and the rational deliberation is represented by circles, whereas social emotional by squares. And we can see that they coincide in almost for wisdom and knowledge, which means that the rational deliberation has a positive contribution, positive role towards wisdom, whereas social emotional competence has a negative impact to wisdom. This is a new and interesting information, but we have to follow the logic of regressions, and it goes. It's not just associations. It means that these rational and socio-emotional factors, they confound each other, and these estimates are controlling for each other. So regardless of how rational the person was judged, people judged wise people as less social emotional competent, as low on social emotional competence. So for wisdom and knowledge, the pattern is very clear, with some minor differences across countries, which are probably even insignificant. But it's different for understanding. And we can see that, for example, in Slovakia and Korea and Japan and North America, both rational deliberation and social emotional competence contribute positively to understanding. And in other countries, it's also mixed up. The only exceptions are India and South Africa, in which the relations between dimensions, behavioral dimensions, are related to understanding in the same way as it does to knowledge and wisdom. So the conclusions, quite obvious, right? There are two behavioral dimensions. First is rational deliberation, and second, social emotional competence. Probably there are better labels, and we welcome any input on suggestions on better labels. But it goes well with previous literature. Rational deliberation is used to evaluate knowledge, ability, and wisdom, whereas social emotional competence is used to evaluate understanding. Well, it's a little bit of overstating, but yes, social emotional competence is much more closer related to understanding than to knowledge and wisdom. The pattern across cultures is very consistent. The structural factors is very similar, and the position of characters is very similar, and regression coefficients are even similar, with a few structural deviations in South Africa and India. In South Africa and India, probably the characters are lumped together due to more holistic perception of people instead of analytical in other countries. And Morocco stands out by very high ratings on social emotional competence of U character. And finally, U character, people rate themselves usually as one of the highest on social emotional competence, but usually not the highest on rational deliberation, which means that people can accept the fact that some other people are smarter, but it's hard to imagine that you are not as social not as altruistic, and not as social-emotional competent person as others. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. And questions, probably substantive questions to Igor, are very welcome. And I'm happy to defend my numbers and pictures.
Thanks, Maxim.